Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever is holding it right now. Picture a cave cut into the face of a mountain in Japan. One oil lamp burns close to the floor. The light is small and warm and steady. It catches the surface of an inkstone, a low writing table, a small stack of paper, and it catches the hands of the man sitting before them. Large hands, scarred, completely still. His name is Miyamoto Musashi. He fought more than 60 single combats and walked away from every one. He painted, carved, and wrote with a precision that serious artists of his era found remarkable. He moved through the world for 60 years without a permanent home, without a lord's protection, without the belonging that his society considered the basic condition of a meaningful life. He never stopped, until the mountain stopped him. Tonight he is writing down everything he understood about how to live and how to fight, and what those two things finally have to do with each other. Settle in. Let the mountain be quiet around you, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Boy, the War Maid. Western Japan, in the 1580s, had a particular quality of light in the late afternoon of a summer day. It came in low across the rice paddies, catching the dust above the footpaths, turning the whole landscape a shade of gold that the people who grew up there carried inside them for the rest of their lives as the specific colour of home. The air in those hours smelled of warm earth and cut grass, and the particular sweetness of rice plants in season. Children playing at the edges of fields would stop sometimes, without knowing why, and stand still in that light, feeling the weight of it against their skin like something alive. Miyamoto Musashi was born into that light. He was born in the village of Miyamoto, in the province of Mimasaka, in what is now the Okayama prefecture of Western Japan. The year of his birth is given in most careful biographical accounts as 1584, though some sources place it a year earlier, and the historical record does not settle the question with certainty. What the record is more consistent about is the world he arrived in. His father was a man named Shinmen Munisai. Munisai was a martial artist of documented accomplishment, recognized by the Ashikaga shogunate for his skill with the jute, a short iron weapon used to catch and break sword blades. He was not a warm man by any account that has survived. He was a man of discipline and very little patience for softness. The village knew his reputation and respected it in the careful way that people respect things they would prefer not to test directly. The relationship between Musashi and his father is one of the genuinely unclear passages in his early biography. Some accounts suggest Musashi was raised not by Munisai, but by an uncle named Dorimbo, a Buddhist monk on his mother's side, after his parents separated or his mother died. Other accounts suggest Munisai played an active role in his son's early training. The sources do not agree. What they do agree on is this. By the time Musashi was old enough to hold a weapon seriously, he had been exposed to a quality of martial discipline unusual even in a country that had been at war, in one form or another, for most of the previous century and a half. That country is the first thing to understand if you want to understand what made him. Japan, in the late 16th century, was a place where violence was not an abstraction. It was not something that happened elsewhere, to other people, in distant provinces that ordinary life never touched. It was the organizing fact of political existence. The period historians call the Sengoku, which translates roughly as warring states, had been running for well over 100 years by the time Musashi was born. It had dissolved the old feudal order and replaced it with something more brutal and more fluid. Picture a village in Mimasaka on an ordinary afternoon in the 1580s. The same golden light falling across the same paddies. A farmer working the edge of his field looks up and watches a column of armed men pass on the road without stopping. He does not know whose men they are. He does not ask. He returns to his work and listens until the sound of them fades and the road is quiet again. This was not an unusual afternoon. It was most afternoons. Warlords rose and fell. Alliances formed and collapsed in a season. Armies moved through villages that had no quarrel with anyone and left behind landscapes that survivors rebuilt from what remained. Into this world, Musashi arrived. He grew up in a household shaped by martial practice, in a province shaped by martial necessity, at a moment when the entire question of who would rule Japan was approaching its final violent resolution. The men around him were men who had fought, or who were preparing to fight, or who were still carrying the damage from having fought. The measure they applied to other men ran through a single question. Can you survive what is coming? There is an account, preserved in the Niten Ki, a biographical document compiled in the mid-17th century by scholars within the tradition Musashi founded, of Musashi, at the age of 13, fighting and killing a travelling swordsman named Arima Kihei. Kihei was a practitioner of the Shinto Ryu style who had posted a public challenge in Musashi's village, inviting any local martial artists to face him. The challenge was answered, according to the account, by the 13-year-old Musashi, who threw Kihei to the ground and beat him to death with a wooden staff when he would not yield. The Niten Ki is not a neutral document. It was produced within the tradition Musashi founded, by people with a clear interest in establishing the extraordinary nature of their school's founder. This does not make the account false. It makes it a source that requires careful handling, the way any record produced by devoted followers requires careful handling. You note what it claims. You note where it comes from. You hold the specific details provisionally while taking seriously the broader picture it is painting. The broader picture, supported across multiple independent sources, is of a boy deeply serious about martial practice from a very young age, who carried a quality of physical confidence and psychological fearlessness unusual in someone his age, and who had grown up in conditions that made early confrontation with violence not a shocking exception, but something close to an expected passage. Whether the fight with Arima Kihei happened precisely as described, at 13, with that opponent, in that manner, is something the historical record cannot confirm with certainty at this distance. What the record does support is that Musashi was fighting and winning against adult opponents earlier than almost any comparable figure in the documented history of Japanese martial arts. And then the war he had been born into arrived at its conclusion. In the autumn of 1600, on a plain in the province of Mino called Sekigahara, the question of who would rule Japan was answered in a single day of catastrophic violence. Two great coalitions of feudal lords had been building toward each other for years. On one side stood the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful surviving warlord after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. On the other stood a coalition assembled in the name of Hideyoshi's young heir. The battle involved somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 men. It lasted a single morning. By afternoon, the field was covered in the dead. The Toyotomi coalition had broken, and Tokugawa Ieyasu was on his way to a dominance of Japan that would last for the next 2.5 centuries. The Niten Ki records that Musashi was present at Sekigahara, and most serious biographical accounts of his life accept this participation as grounded in credible tradition, though the details of his specific role in the battle are not fully documented. What those accounts agree on is that he fought on the losing side. He was 16 years old. This is one of the facts about his early life that popular retellings tend to move past quickly, because it does not fit the mythological shape the story prefers. The greatest swordsman in Japanese history began his military career by fighting for the faction that lost the defining battle of his era. He walked away from Sekigahara alive, which was not a small achievement given what the field looked like by afternoon. But he walked away into a Japan now controlled by men who had been his enemies. What he carried out of that field, beyond his life, the sources do not record directly. He did not write about Sekigahara in any surviving document. He did not discuss it at length with his students. As far as the record shows, the battle appears in his biography as a fact and then recedes, leaving behind only the outline of a 16-year-old who had just witnessed organized human violence at the largest scale available to his era, and who was now going to have to decide what to do with everything he had survived. He did not go home. He did not find a lord to serve. He did not do what most surviving soldiers on the losing side did, which was to find some quiet corner of the new order and make themselves small and unremarkable. He went looking for something he could not yet name, not out of recklessness. What the sources describe consistently is a person who had looked directly at what the world was made of and decided that the only honest response was to test himself against it without flinching, without the comfort of illusion, without pretending it was something other than what it was. He was 16. He had survived Sekigahara. He had watched the world resolve its largest question in a single morning of blood and smoke. The field was behind him. The new Japan was taking its shape in the distance, and the boy the war had made was walking toward it, carrying nothing but a sword and a question he did not yet have words for. Chapter 2. The First Kill and What It Cost. The village of Hirafuku in the morning had the particular stillness of a place that does not yet know what the day will bring. Smoke rising from cook fires, the sound of water moving in the irrigation channels at the edge of the fields, a dog somewhere, barking once and then going quiet, the sky still pale at the edges, the light not yet warm, the air carrying the night's cold in the shadows where the sun had not yet reached. Into that stillness, two people walked toward each other. Something happens to a person the first time they take a life. It does not matter how prepared they believe themselves to be. Something shifts. In the place where a person keeps their understanding of what they are capable of, what the world actually permits, what cannot be taken back, and that shift does not reverse. We cannot know what that shift felt like for Musashi specifically. The sources do not give us his interior experience, and we should be honest about that gap rather than filling it with confident narration. What we can do is look carefully at what the record shows, and listen to what the silence around it is saying. The account comes from the Niten Ki, a travelling swordsman named Arima Kihei, a practitioner of the Shinto Ryu style, arrived in the village of Hirafuku and posted a public challenge. This was a recognized practice in the martial culture of the period. A travelling martial artist would announce his willingness to face any local practitioner. The challenge operated within a formal social code governing who could accept, what weapons were appropriate, and what outcome constituted an honourable conclusion. Musashi accepted. He was 13 years old. He had no formal school affiliation, no adult standing in the martial community that would have made his acceptance socially normal. What he had was his father's training, a physical confidence that people who knew him in later life described consistently as remarkable from an early age, and something else the sources circle around without naming directly, a quality of absolute seriousness that sat in him like stone and did not move regardless of the circumstances pressing against it. Kihei did not take the boy seriously at first. This is understandable. A travelling swordsman of established reputation, facing what appeared to be a child, would not have adjusted his assessment upward. He would have seen a minor embarrassment to dispose of quickly and move on. What happened instead was that Musashi crossed the distance between them before Kihei had fully committed to his stance, threw him to the ground, and when Kihei drew his short blade rather than accepting the outcome, beat him to death with his wooden staff. The Niten Ki presents this without visible discomfort. In the moral framework of the period, the encounter went as it should have. A challenge was issued. It was accepted. The better man won. The loser refused to acknowledge the outcome and paid for that refusal. A clean story. A clear lesson. But there is another layer underneath the clean story. Musashi was 13. Kihei was a grown man of professional martial standing. Whatever the formal rules said about the legitimacy of the encounter, the physical reality of that morning was a child killing an adult with his hands, and then standing over what he had done, and continuing to exist in a world that had just changed its shape around him permanently. What the sources do not give us is any account of what he felt afterward. This is not unusual for the period or the genre. The biographical literature of feudal Japan does not dwell on interior experience. The deed is the record. The feeling is private and largely irrelevant to the public account. But we should be careful here. We can note the silence without pretending to fill it. What we can do is listen to what came after. Musashi spent the next 50 years building a practice around the management of one specific thing: the noise of the mind under pressure. He returned to this again and again in the Go Rin No Sho, the book he wrote in the cave near the end of his life. He described a state he called empty mind, a condition in which the practitioner has moved past the interference of conscious thought and emotion and operates from pure instinctual clarity. He described this not as a gift, but as the result of long practice. Years. A process that most people never complete because most people cannot tolerate what it requires. He emphasized the word long. Long practice. Years of work. A process of wearing down the noise of the untrained mind through repetition and pressure and honest engagement with conditions that do not permit the maintenance of comfortable illusions. The question underneath this, the question his writing raises without answering directly, is what the starting point of that long process actually was. What was the noise that needed wearing down? We cannot know the answer for Musashi specifically. The record does not permit us to. But the man who wrote the Go Rin No Sho 50 years after that morning in Hirafuku had clearly spent a very long time working on something. The end point he described: the quiet mind, the empty mind, the mind that moves without interference, reads like the hard-won solution to a problem that began when he was very young. The morning light in Hirafuku moved slowly across the road as the sun climbed. The cook fire smoke drifted and dispersed. The dog did not bark again. The village returned to itself, the way villages do after something has happened within them that most people did not see. He picked up his staff. He walked away. That is all the record gives us. In its silence, it is enough. Chapter 3. The Road with No Master. In the years after Sekigahara, the roads of Japan were full of men with nowhere particular to go. The battle had ended one era and opened another, and the opening was not clean. The Tokugawa victory did not instantly produce peace. It produced a new hierarchy, a new set of winning and losing factions, and a very large number of men trained for warfare who now existed in a world that was slowly and unevenly running out of wars for them to fight. Some found positions with lords who had backed the winning side. Some drifted into whatever employment required their particular skills. And some did what Musashi did. They walked. The practice had a name, Musha Shudyo. It translates roughly as warrior's austere training, or warrior's pilgrimage. A practitioner who wanted to develop his skills beyond what any single teacher or school could provide would take to the road, moving province to province, seeking skilled opponents, learning from each encounter what repetition within a single system could not teach. The roads in those years had a particular texture. In winter, the mountain passes between provinces were cold, in the specific way that high ground in Japan is cold. A wet cold that found the gaps in clothing and stayed there. The post towns along the major routes had lodgings and food. But a man travelling without institutional backing travelled on the margins of what those towns offered. Cheaper rooms. Whatever was available to eat rather than whatever was good. The smell of those rooms was wood smoke and damp straw, and the accumulated presence of other travellers passing through on their way to somewhere else. The sound at night was the sound of a country adjusting to its new peace. Carts on roads, bells from distant temples. The particular silence that follows when a long war finally stops and the world is still deciding what to do with itself. Musashi moved through all of this without apparent complaint. Most practitioners of the warrior's pilgrimage would eventually resolve their wandering by affiliating with a school, receiving a certification in a recognized style, and taking their skills into service with a lord. The pilgrimage was, for most people, a phase, demanding and formative, but with an expected endpoint. Musashi never reached that endpoint. He had trained with his father in the Tori Ryu style from childhood, and the biographical sources mention contact with other teachers in his youth. Though the details of those affiliations are not well documented, what is documented, because Musashi states it directly in the Go Rin No Sho, is that he did not attribute his development to any master or any school. He writes, in the opening pages of that work, that he practiced the way of strategy since his youth, that his first duel was at age 13, and that after many contests he found other men's strategies to be insufficient. He does not say this with contempt. He says it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting an observation he did not particularly want to make, but could not honestly avoid. He found, through direct experience, that the frameworks being offered to him did not account for what he was actually encountering. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what the martial world of his era actually was. It was not a loosely organized collection of individuals doing roughly similar things in slightly different ways. It was a highly structured world of competing schools, each with its own lineage, its own technical vocabulary, its own certification system. Each school was a social institution, a claim about the nature of combat, a tradition with weight and history and the accumulated authority of generations. Picture a practice hall in one of the larger schools of the period. 30 men in formal training clothes moving through the same sequence of movements at the same time, their teacher calling the count. The sound of wooden weapons against wooden weapons, filling the air with a rhythm as precise as the ticking of a clock. Tradition visible in every detail, in the way the weapons are held, the way the feet are placed, the way the body inclines at each transition, generations of accumulated refinement pressed into the bodies of the men practicing it. This was the world Musashi moved through without finding a home in. He challenged practitioners from multiple schools. He defeated them consistently, according to the record. And from each encounter he took not the school's curriculum, but something more fundamental, an observation about what actually worked when two people who were both seriously trying to win stood in front of each other with weapons. A student of a school learns what the school teaches and understands his experience through the school's framework. If the framework has gaps, he often does not see them, because the framework is also the lens he is looking through. Musashi was looking at the encounters directly. What he was seeing was that many things the frameworks claimed were essential were not. In fact, deciding the outcomes. Elaborate technique. Refined forms. Precise timing systems built for specific situations. All of these fell apart under the pressure of an opponent who was not cooperating with the assumptions built into them. He was not the first person to notice this, but he was unusually systematic about following the observation to its conclusions, and unusually willing to pay the price that following it required. The price was isolation. A man who will not affiliate with a school in a world organized around schools is outside the primary networks through which support, reputation, and social standing flow. He must build his reputation entirely through direct encounter. He must keep winning, every time, against opponents whose failures would have been quietly absorbed by the institutional structures he refused. Musashi accepted this without apparent hesitation. He ate what was available. He slept where he could. He owned very little. He dressed without the attention to appearance that most martial artists of standing in his period considered important. There are accounts of opponents, upon meeting him before a contest, being surprised by his appearance. A man of his growing reputation, they seemed to expect, would look a certain way. He did not look that way. He looked like a man who had spent years on roads in all weathers, and who had never considered his appearance a relevant variable in any serious question. This was not accidental. In the Go Rin No Sho, Musashi distinguishes repeatedly between what things look like and what they are. He is skeptical of anything whose value lies primarily in how it appears to an observer rather than in what it actually does under pressure. The road years were where this understanding began to take its shape, not as a philosophy, as a lived condition, built one cold morning at a time. Picture him now on a winter road somewhere between provinces, the sky low and grey, the mountains on either side of the pass holding their snow in the shadows. He is walking alone, as he almost always walks. His equipment minimal, his pace steady. He is thinking about the last encounter, turning it over in the way a craftsman turns over a piece of work to find where the weakness is. Not what went right, what would have gone wrong if the opponent had done something slightly different. what the form assumed that reality did not guarantee, finding the gap, again, between what the frameworks claim and what actually happens. He was moving through a Japan that was itself in transformation. The Tokugawa order was consolidating. The martial schools were expanding their formal certification systems. The performance of martial skill was becoming more important as actual application in open warfare became less frequent. Musashi was moving in the opposite direction. While the institutions around him were adding complexity, he was removing it. While the schools were teaching their students how to win within their systems, he was testing what happened when there were no systems, but the ones that physics and the irreducible reality of two people with weapons imposed. He was going, in the language his later writing would develop, to the ground of the thing. This is not a comfortable place to spend a decade. The loneliness of a man who trusts his own observation more than any available authority is real and specific, and not easily romanticized when you are living it rather than reading about it. There is a reason most people, given the choice, take the path that runs through institutions and the warmth of belonging to something larger than themselves. Musashi did not take that path. What the road was building in him, underneath the accumulating record of encounters that ended in his favour, was something no school could have provided, because no school could have provided the conditions. A man who trusted nothing he had not tested himself, in conditions that did not permit error, against opponents who were trying their hardest to prove him wrong. By his mid-20s, the serious martial world of Japan was beginning to notice him with great care. The encounters coming next would not be informal challenges at provincial posting stages. They would be confrontations with the most respected names in the martial culture of his era, in front of witnesses. With everything riding on the outcome, the road had almost finished its work. What it had made was almost ready. Chapter 4. Yoshioka, the name he had to break. Kyoto, in the early 1600s, was a city that knew exactly what it was. 800 years, as the imperial capital had settled into the stones of its streets and the timber of its gateposts, and the particular way the morning mist moved through its temple districts in autumn. The Kamo River ran through the city's eastern edge, with the unhurried quality of water that has been flowing past important things for a very long time. The markets along its banks opened before dawn. Vendors arranging their goods by lamplight. The smell of charcoal smoke and river water and fresh fish mixing in the cool air. By midday, the streets around the palace district would be full of the particular kind of movement that belongs to a city that understands its own centrality and does not need to announce it. This was where Musashi came in approximately 1604. He was 20 years old. He had been on the road for several years. He had a record. He had no institutional standing, no lord's backing, no certification from any recognized school. What he had was the reputation that a man builds one encounter at a time, and the word had preceded him into the capital. He had come to face the Yoshioka family. To understand what this meant requires understanding what the Yoshioka family was. They were not simply a good school. They were the most prestigious swordsmanship institution in Kyoto, which meant, in the cultural geography of the period, the most prestigious in Japan. For generations, they had served as the official swordsmanship instructors to the Ashikaga shogunate. They had taught the ruling class of Japan how to use swords. Through that service, they had accumulated a social position that went far beyond what any individual fighter's skill could confer. Their name carried the weight of institutional authority, imperial adjacency, and the accumulated prestige of a lineage that stretched back further than most people in Kyoto could remember. When a 20-year-old from Mimasaka, with no school and no lord, walked into Kyoto and challenged them, he was not simply challenging their martial skill, he was challenging the entire structure of established authority that their name represented. What followed is documented across multiple sources. Though not all sources agree on every detail, the honest approach is to work with what the weight of evidence supports while noting where it thins. The first encounter was with the head of the school, Yoshioka Seijuro. They met at a location outside the city called Rendaiji. Seijuro arrived at the appointed time. Musashi arrived late. How late, and whether the lateness was deliberate, is a point on which the sources do not fully agree. What they agree on is the outcome. Musashi struck Seijuro with a single decisive blow that broke his sword arm and ended the fight. Seijuro, according to several accounts, never fully recovered. He withdrew from martial practice and spent his remaining years in a monastery. The second encounter was with Seijuro's younger brother, Yoshioka Denshichiro, who took up the challenge on behalf of the family's honor. Denshichiro was, by the accounts, the more formidable fighter of the two brothers. He arrived carrying a long hardwood staff, a weapon chosen specifically to extend his reach and change the geometry of the encounter in ways intended to neutralize what Musashi had shown against his brother. Musashi killed him. The fight was fast. A single decisive movement before Denshichiro had fully established his approach. Two brothers, two encounters, two outcomes that could not be revised. What happened next is where the story requires more care than the popular retellings typically give it. The Yoshioka school, now led, in practical terms, by younger family members and allied students, issued a third challenge. The opponent named was Yoshioka Matashichiro, the young son of Seijuro. The accounts describe him as approximately 12 years of age. The challenge came with a large number of armed supporters positioned around the meeting place in a configuration that was clearly not a formal duel, but an ambush, a collective attempt to end the threat Musashi represented. Musashi arrived before the appointed time. Against Seijuro, he had arrived late. Against this ambush, he arrived early, moved into position before the full force assembled, and struck first. Matashichiro died. Musashi fought through the supporters in the chaos that followed and escaped. The Yoshioka school did not recover. Now sit with the third encounter for a moment, not with the tactical logic of it, which is clear enough. With the human reality, Matashichiro was approximately 12 years old. He was the nominal head of the challenge, but not the actual threat. The actual threat was the armed men around him. The child was placed at the center of an attack designed to use his presence as a constraint on what Musashi could do. Musashi responded by killing the child first. From inside the logic of survival in that moment, this was the correct decision. Eliminating the nominal head disrupted the organized response. It created the moment of confusion that gave him his best chance of getting out alive. The child was still 12 years old. Musashi did not address this in the Go Rin No Sho. He did not, as far as the record shows, discuss it directly in any surviving document. The tradition around him does not dwell on it. The popular mythology largely skips past it. But the man who came out of Kyoto was carrying something he had not carried when he arrived. Not guilt, necessarily, in the way a modern framework would apply that word. Something more specific. The knowledge of what he was willing to do when the alternative was dying, and what doing it cost in the currency that serious violence extracts from the people who practice it without the buffer of distance. He left Kyoto with his life, his reputation, and something heavier than either. He was 20 years old. The road to the south received him back. Pine resin and cold water and the particular quality of silence that mountain roads have when the city falls behind and there is nothing ahead but the next pass and the province beyond it. He was walking toward whatever came next. And in the years to come, what came next would put everything Kyoto had given him to its final test. Chapter 5. Sasaki Kojiro. The fight that never happened the way you heard it. 8 years passed between Kyoto and the island. 8 years of continued movement, continued encounters, continued testing of the understanding that the road and the Yoshioka fights had built. The record of those years is thinner than the years before and after, which is consistent with a man who had proven the central claim of his reputation and was now doing the deeper, quieter work of understanding what he had proven and what it actually meant. By 1612 he was 28 years old. He was, by any serious measure, the most accomplished unaffiliated swordsman in Japan, and he was about to fight the most famous duel in Japanese history. The strait between the provinces of Busan and Nagato is narrow enough that on a clear day you can see from one shore to the other. In the early morning of the 13th day of the 4th month of 1612, the water in that strait would have been the particular colour it turns in spring, grey, green and cold, catching the light at the surface and losing it immediately below. Small fishing boats moved in the distance. The island of Ganryujima, uninhabited, sat in the middle of the channel, the way small islands sit in channels, as if placed there by someone who needed a neutral ground and found one. Let us begin with what the evidence actually supports. On that morning, Miyamoto Musashi fought a man named Sasaki Kojiro on that island. Kojiro died. Musashi walked away. The encounter lasted, by most accounts, less than a minute. These are the points on which the sources are in substantial agreement. Everything else about the most famous single combat in Japanese history is more complicated. Sasaki Kojiro was a real person. This is worth stating clearly, because the weight of legend around this encounter is heavy enough that the historical reality of both men sometimes disappears underneath it. Kojiro was a swordsman of genuine accomplishment. He was associated with the Ganryu school of swordsmanship, a style noted for its use of a long blade and for a specific technique known as the swallow's tail cut, a downward sweeping strike of considerable power and precision. He had built a reputation serious enough that the lord of the Hosokawa domain, Hosokawa Tadaoki, had taken him into formal service as a sword instructor. This last point matters more than it might appear. Kojiro was not an unaffiliated traveller. He was an employed retainer of one of the significant lords of Western Japan. He had a position, a patron, a social identity within the formal structure of the Tokugawa order. When he fought Musashi, he was fighting as a man with something to protect beyond his life. His institutional standing, his lord's investment in his reputation, the formal social position that a man of his type derived from his relationship with power. Musashi, at this point in his life, still had none of those things. The asymmetry between the two men was not in their fighting skill, which the encounter would resolve, but in their social position. The man with institutional standing lost. The man with no institution won. The arrangements were made through intermediaries. The Hosokawa domain was involved in the logistics. The small island was chosen as neutral ground. A time was set. And then Musashi was late. Not by a few minutes. By the accounts. Somewhere between 2 and several hours. The sources explain this differently. Some say he was sleeping when the appointed time came. Some say he spent the morning fashioning a wooden sword from an oar on the boat. Some suggest the lateness was deliberate psychological strategy, designed to erode Kojiro's composure during the wait. Later sources add detail and colour to each version in ways consistent with how oral traditions develop, which is to say, in the direction of the story that best serves the myth. We cannot determine which account is accurate. The honest position is to acknowledge the range and let it sit without forcing a resolution. The evidence does not support. On the island, Kojiro had been waiting a long time. Picture him there, a man of genuine skill and serious professional standing. On a small island in the middle of a cold strait, in front of witnesses representing his lord's domain, the appointed hour had passed. Then more time had passed. The boats watching from a distance, the witnesses saying nothing, the water moving around the island with complete indifference to the situation of the man standing on it. Each minute of waiting was its own kind of defeat, and he knew it. When Musashi finally stepped off the boat, Kojiro drew his sword immediately. The sword he carried was famous, long, longer than standard, and its length was the foundation of his technical identity as a fighter. The platform for the swallow's tail technique that had made his reputation, he threw the scabbard into the sea. Musashi, according to the most often cited account, observed that Kojiro had already lost. A man who discards his scabbard has decided he is not returning from this fight. That is not the mind of a man who wins. Whether those exact words were spoken in that exact moment, we cannot verify. The exchange appears in sources written well after the event. What is consistent across the accounts is that Kojiro's emotional state when the fight began was not controlled. The fight ended almost immediately. Musashi struck, and struck with a precision that left no ambiguity. Kojiro fell, whether he died instantly or made a final strike from the ground that cut Musashi's sleeve or headband, as some accounts describe, is another point the sources handle differently. What they agree on is that Musashi bowed to the witnesses, returned to the boat, and was rowed away. He was 28 years old. Now, the mythology that has grown around this encounter has done something to Kojiro that the historical record does not support. It has made him a foil, a figure whose narrative function is to be defeated so that Musashi's genius can be demonstrated. The dramatic version needs Kojiro to represent something that Musashi transcends: institutional pride, technical limitation, the blindness that comes from always being acknowledged within a particular system. The historical Kojiro does not fit that shape. He was a skilled practitioner who had built a serious reputation through genuine work, earned the formal patronage of a significant lord, and died on an island in his late 20s or early 30s. In a fight he had not sought and could not decline without losing everything his career had built. His anger on the island was not foolishness. It was the response of a professional who understood exactly what the long wait had already taken from him. His final strike. The cut that reportedly caught Musashi's clothing, even as he was falling, suggests a man who maintained technical precision under the worst possible conditions. He deserves more than the mythology gave him. Musashi, to his credit, does not appear to have needed the mythology. He did not speak of Kojiro with contempt in any surviving writing. The Go Rin No Sho does not mention Kojiro by name. The encounter appears as one point in a long series, each of which taught him something. That restraint is its own kind of testimony. The boat moved away from the island. The water closed behind it. The fishing boats continued their work in the distance. The strait moved as it had always moved, grey-green and cold, and completely indifferent to what had just happened on the small piece of land in its middle. The man being rowed back to shore was already thinking about what came next, not about what he had just done, about what he still had to learn. Chapter 6. War and Defeat. The years nobody talks about. There is a silence in the historical record around the years 16, 14, and 16, 15. Not an accidental silence. Not a gap produced simply by the loss of documents across 4 centuries. A silence too consistent and too complete to be anything other than a choice. The places where a man who wrote carefully about almost everything he had experienced simply does not go. Those silences are not empty. They are full of something the person decided, for reasons of their own, to keep. Before entering the silence, here is what we know. Many later accounts place Musashi at the siege of Osaka Castle during those 2 years. The Niten Ki and several subsequent biographical sources position him among the forces gathered there. Though the exact nature of his participation and the details of his specific role remain uncertain, what historians who have worked carefully with the available material are more consistent about is this: he was somewhere during those years. The years 1614 and 1615 are years he does not account for in his own surviving writing, and the man who emerges in the years immediately following is a different kind of man from the one who entered them. With that honest framing in place, let us look at what Osaka actually was. It was not a single event. It was 2 campaigns, separated by a winter truce, known as the Winter Campaign of 1614 and the Summer Campaign of 1615. Together, they represented the final military confrontation between the consolidated Tokugawa shogunate and the last significant opposition to it. The forces gathered around Toyotomi Hideori, the son of the great unifier Hideyoshi, in the enormous fortress complex at Osaka. The castle itself was formidable in the way that only the largest things built by human hands can be formidable. Its walls rose above the city in layers, each one thicker than the last, surrounded by moats whose breadth and depth had been calculated to make direct assault as costly as possible. Inside those walls, in the weeks of the winter campaign, the mornings had a specific quality. The cold came in off the moats before dawn, and the sound that filled the garrison at first light was the sound of thousands of men waking in close quarters, the cough of fires being stoked, the clank of equipment being checked, the particular low murmur of men who are waiting for something they know is coming and cannot stop. The smell was wood smoke and horses and damp earth, and the particular sharpness of armour that has been worn in cold weather, a smell that anyone who has lived in a military encampment recognizes and does not forget. Outside those walls, the Tokugawa forces numbered somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 men by various estimates. The castle held through the winter. A negotiated truce was reached. The terms included the filling of some of the outer defensive moats, a condition whose full military implications the Toyotomi side may not have entirely grasped at the time of agreeing to it. When the summer campaign opened in 1615, those filled moats meant the castle's defensive strength had been substantially compromised before the fighting resumed. The summer campaign was shorter and more violent. The outer defences fell in stages. The castle complex was breached. The fires that followed burned for days. The smoke was visible from the hills surrounding the city, rising into the summer sky in columns that the people of the surrounding villages watched without speaking. Understanding what they meant, the last serious military opposition to Tokugawa rule was finished. The era of open warfare in Japan was, for all practical purposes, over. If the accounts placing Musashi at Osaka are accurate, he survived again. He had done this before. The tradition records him on the losing side at Sekigahara at 16, finding his way out of a collapsing military situation alive when many men around him did not. If he was at Osaka, he carried into it the particular knowledge that only a person who has already survived one catastrophic defeat on the wrong side of history possesses. He knew what the collapse of a military situation feels like from inside it. He knew how to read the moment when the window for movement is narrowing. He knew that survival in those conditions has nothing to do with loyalty to the cause, and everything to do with clarity of perception in the specific seconds, when clarity is the only thing that matters. He came out alive, and then he went quiet. The years immediately following 1615 show the least biographical activity of any comparable period in Musashi's adult life. The dense record of challenges accepted and issued, of travels and encounters and the accumulating testimony of people who had seen or heard of him, thins noticeably. He was somewhere. He was doing something. The sources do not give us a clear account of where or what. Why was Musashi at Osaka? If the accounts are accurate, he was not a man of political ideology in the documented sense. He did not leave behind statements of loyalty to the Toyotomi cause. Several honest possibilities present themselves without forcing a definitive answer. The evidence does not support. One is obligation. The martial culture of the period operated on systems of loyalty and debt that functioned as genuine moral compulsions. A man with connections, however indirect, to the Toyotomi cause might have found himself at Osaka not because he calculated the odds favourably, but because the connections created obligations that did not permit a clean exit. Another is the nature of the gathering itself. The Toyotomi side at Osaka attracted a significant number of men who were, like Musashi, unaffiliated with the new Tokugawa order, men who had not found or not sought a settled position in the consolidating hierarchy. The losing side of these final campaigns was, in some respects, the natural home of men who had never quite fit into the winning side's framework. A third is simpler. The certainty we feel looking back at these events was not available to the men making decisions in the weeks before they unfolded. Wars that look inevitable in retrospect are rarely experienced as inevitable by the people living through them. What we know is what came after. The silence. Then a man in his early 30s who has stopped doing the thing that defined him since boyhood, no longer seeking opponents, no longer moving toward the next serious test. Beginning, slowly and without announcement, to turn towards something different. The question that had driven him since that morning in Hirafuku, when he was 13 years old, had arrived at something it recognized as an answer. He knew what he was made of, not as a claim he was making to the world, as a thing he had finished finding out. The question underneath that answer was just beginning to take its shape. It would take him 30 more years to find the words for it. Chapter 7. The Dojo Years. Teaching without settling. Picture a practice hall in the city of Himeji on a grey morning in early winter. Sometime in the 1620s, the floor is wooden and worn smooth from years of footwork. Cold comes up through the boards in the way that cold comes up through wooden floors that are not well sealed against winter, not painfully but persistently. A reminder that the ground beneath the building has its own temperature and its own patience. The air in the hall carries the smell of cedar and lacquered wood, and the particular sharpness of a space where people have been working hard for a long time. Outside the hall's narrow windows, the white walls of Himeji Castle rise above the town in the morning mist. From almost anywhere in this city you can see those walls. They have a way of making whatever you are doing feel like it is happening in the presence of something that will outlast you. Something that has already outlasted many things and is in no hurry. Inside the hall, two men face each other. One is a student, young, serious, well-trained. He has been practicing for years, and his technique is clean, and his commitment is genuine. He makes a movement. It is a good movement, executed with precision. The other man watches from a few feet away. He is in his mid-30s, lean, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has spent a long time learning not to waste motion. He says nothing for a moment after the student's movement. Then he says, quietly, "You are watching your own sword." The student stops. He stands very still. Something has just been given to him that he will spend years unpacking. The teacher is Miyamoto Musashi. The Japan that Musashi was teaching in had changed fundamentally from the Japan he had grown up in. The Tokugawa peace was real now, not fragile, not provisional, but settled in the specific way that a political order settles when it has been in place long enough for people to stop being surprised by it. The roads were safer. The great castle towns were growing. Commerce was expanding. And the samurai class, which existed because it could fight and might need to, was beginning to navigate the particular difficulty of a world that needed it to fight less and less with each passing year. For the martial schools, this peace created a structural pressure that would reshape the entire tradition over the following generations. Without active warfare providing continuous feedback about what worked, the schools began to drift in the direction that institutions drift when the external pressure that created them relaxes. Toward ceremony, toward the refinement of form over the testing of function, toward the elaborate performance of martial excellence rather than the grinding, unglamorous work of building it. Musashi saw this happening and was not neutral about it. In the Go Rin No Sho, he would later describe this drift with a specific term: the flowering of technique, the tendency of martial schools to develop their curricula in the direction of aesthetic refinement rather than practical effectiveness. He did not write about this with contempt for individual practitioners. He wrote about it with the frustration of someone who knows what the real thing is and watches the ornamental substitute being presented as equivalent. His own teaching was built around a different premise. The school he had been developing across these years, the Niten Ichi-ryu, took its name from its central technical approach. Niten Ichi translates roughly as two heavens as one. It described Musashi's method of fighting with two swords simultaneously, a long sword and a short sword, used as a coordinated system in which each creates conditions for the other. This was not entirely without precedent in Japanese martial practice, but Musashi's development of it was systematic in a way earlier approaches had not been, and the principles underlying it extended far beyond the specific question of how to use two blades. At the center of everything he taught was a single, insistent question: what is actually necessary here? And what only appears necessary because of habit or convention or the desire to look a certain way? He applied this question to footwork, to grip, to the management of distance and timing, to the mental state of the practitioner before a confrontation, to the structure of practice itself. What do you repeat? What do you pay attention to? What does the work require you to give up that you would prefer to keep? His students found this harder than learning technique. Technique can be transmitted by repetition. You do the thing enough times, with a good teacher correcting your errors, and the body learns it. The learning is real, and it matters. But what Musashi was trying to transmit went past what repetition could produce, into the territory where the student had to do something the teacher could not do for them. See what was actually in front of them, not what they expected to see, not what the form required, what was actually there, in this moment, with this specific opponent, moving in this specific way. Back in the Himeji Hall, the student who had been told he was watching his own sword stood still for a long moment. The cold came up through the floor. The castle walls held the mist outside. In the hall it was very quiet. The teacher did not elaborate. He waited. The student tried the movement again. This time something was different. Not his technique, his attention. It had moved from the sword he was holding to the person he was holding it against, to what was actually there rather than to what the movement required him to produce, to the gap between his expectation and the reality in front of him. The teacher nodded once, very slightly, said nothing more. That exchange, that small correction delivered in a cold hall on a grey winter morning, is what the Niten Ichi-ryu was actually built on. Not the technical innovation of two swords, not the theory of the void elaborated later in the Go Rin No Sho. The simple, demanding, endlessly repeatable practice of learning to see what was actually there instead of what you expected. Musashi moved during these years between several domains. He spent time in Edo, in Himei, in Ogura, in Kyushu, and in other locations as invitations and circumstances directed. He did not, in any of these places, settle the way a man building an institution settles. He taught intensively and then moved, leaving behind students who had to carry what they had received without him present to remind them what it was for. The moving was deliberate. A student who could practice the method only in the teacher's presence had not learned the principle. He had learned the form. The principle had to be portable, applicable in any environment, robust enough to function when the teacher was gone. Musashi tested this by leaving. The students who had absorbed the principle would be fine. The ones who had absorbed only the form would have to go back to the beginning and look harder. He was also, during these years, deepening the practice that had been running alongside the swordsmanship for most of his adult life, but that had never before had the time and stillness the dojo years provided. He was painting ink on paper, the medium in which the margin for revision is zero, and the quality of attention in the moment of the stroke is the work itself. He produced pieces during these years that practitioners of the art recognized as belonging to a different category than the hobby productions of a warrior with time on his hands. Not because they were technically elaborate, because they carried something that elaborate technique alone does not produce. Musashi understood the connection between the painting and the swordsmanship as direct and structural rather than metaphorical. A brushstroke in ink on paper is what it is the moment it lands. You cannot take it back. You continue from where it has put you, with the same quality of commitment or its absence carried forward into everything that follows. A sword cut is the same. He was teaching both, through different instruments, through the sword in the practice hall in Himeji, and the brush on the paper in the quiet before the hall opened in the morning. He was teaching the same thing. Be present to what is actually there. He was in his 30s and early 40s. He had not yet written the Go Rin No Sho. He had not yet made the paintings that would survive him into the 21st century. He had not yet sat in the cave on the mountain. But the understanding that would produce all of those things was forming here, in the practice halls, in the early mornings before anyone else arrived, in the particular quality of attention he was giving to other people's development and finding, in that giving, something the road years had not given him, the understanding that what he knew was not for him alone. The work of 60 duels and 2 wars and decades of solitary practice had produced something that had to be transmitted, not because his reputation required it, because the thing itself required it. Understanding, at the level he had reached it, does not keep. It moves or it diminishes. In the hall in Himeji, the grey morning light shifted as the clouds outside thinned. The student stood in the middle of the floor, holding his wooden sword, looking at something that was not his own sword. The teacher watched. Outside, the white walls of the castle held the mist. Inside the hall, in the silence between one movement and the next, something was passing from one person to another in the oldest way that anything important passes between people, not through instruction, not through demonstration, through the quality of attention given by someone who had earned the right to give it. And somewhere in the cold morning, in the space between the teacher's quiet words and the student's quiet understanding, the work continued, the way it always had, the way it always would. Chapter 8. The Duel That Changed Everything. Miyake Gunbei and the Last Fight. Something shifts in a person when the question they have been living inside finally resolves. Not the circumstances, not the opponent or the specific shape of the problem in front of them. The question itself resolves, and when it does, the practice built around answering it does not stop, but it changes its character, the way a river changes when it passes through the last of the mountain terrain and enters the plain. Still moving, still purposeful, but moving differently now, with a different relationship to the landscape around it. For Musashi, the encounter with a swordsman named Miyake Gunbei appears to mark something close to that moment. The details of this encounter are less elaborately documented than the Yoshioka fights or the contest at Ganryujima. Gunbei was a serious practitioner, affiliated with the Togun Ryu school, a man of genuine ability who issued a formal challenge to Musashi at some point in the early 1630s in the domain of the Hosokawa lord in Kyushu. The challenge was accepted. The encounter took place. Musashi won. The morning of that encounter would have had the particular quality of winter mornings in Kyushu. Cold and clear. The kind of cold that arrives overnight and announces itself in the breath of the men standing in it. The air carrying the sharpness that comes off the mountains when the sky is very blue and the shadows on the ground are very precise, and everything in the landscape is reduced to its essential shape by the absence of warmth. The ground underfoot was hard. The space between the two men, before anything moved, had the specific stillness of a space where something irreversible is about to happen. Gunbei was prepared. By the accounts, he had studied Musashi's record as carefully as the available information permitted. He came to the meeting with the full intention of winning. He was a serious man, engaging seriously with a serious problem. And the seriousness he brought was real and complete, and it was not enough. Musashi was somewhere in his mid to late 40s. What happened in the encounter itself, the specific sequence of movement and decision, is not recorded in the detail that allows full reconstruction. What the record preserves is the outcome, consistent with every serious encounter in Musashi's documented life, and what happened in the years surrounding it. In the years following the encounter with Gunbei, Musashi stopped seeking duels. Not all at once, not through a single announced decision recorded in a document with a date attached. The withdrawal was gradual. A thinning of the record that had been dense with formal challenges and encounters and the ongoing motion of a man always moving toward the next serious opponent. That record thins in his 40s and then effectively ends. He continued to practice. He continued to teach. But the road years, with their relentless forward motion toward whoever could provide the hardest available test, were behind him. Why? This is one of the most genuinely interesting questions in his biography, and popular treatments tend to answer it too quickly. The most common explanation is that he had simply run out of opponents worth facing. He had beaten everyone at the level the practice required, and the field was exhausted. This explanation has the appeal of making his withdrawal a natural consequence of excellence rather than a choice. But it does not hold up. Japan, in the 1630s, still contained serious practitioners of real ability. The schools were full of skilled men. The idea that no opponent of sufficient quality remained is not supported by what we know about the period. A second explanation, with more substance, is that the Tokugawa regulatory environment was making the challenge culture increasingly difficult to sustain. The shogunate had been developing regulations around private combat that changed the legal position of men who participated in formal duels. This was a real factor, but it is difficult to read it as the primary cause of a shift that runs deeper than legal calculation. Musashi had spent his entire adult life operating outside the formal structures of the martial world without being particularly deterred by the social costs. A regulatory change would have been something he noticed. It is harder to believe it was the thing that stopped him. The third explanation is the one his own writing supports most directly, though it does so between the lines rather than in explicit statement. He had found the answer to the question. Not the question of whether he could win. He had known that answer for years. The question that the fighting had always been aimed at was larger. It was the question he had been carrying since he was 13 years old in Hirafuku and first discovered what he was capable of. The question of what he was made of. At the deepest level, where technique and courage and all the other nameable components of martial excellence run out and something more essential either exists or does not. He had been testing that question for 30 years. 30 years of road and cold and encounters that should have killed him and did not. 30 years of moving toward the hardest available pressure and finding out, again and again, what was underneath everything he had built and learned. And the testing had produced an answer. Not a verbal answer, not a principle he could write down and point to and say, "Here, this is what all of it was for." It was the particular quality of certainty that comes only to people who have pressed a question all the way to its ground, and found that the ground holds. A certainty that does not need to keep proving itself because it has already been proven, past the point where further proof adds anything. A man who knows what he is made of does not need to keep finding out. What came into the space the question had occupied was something quieter and in some respects stranger, a kind of attention that had nowhere left to go but inward and forward, toward the things that the fighting had always been pointing at, but that the fighting itself could not fully reach. The cave on the mountain was still years away. The Go Rin No Sho was still unwritten. The Dokkodo had not yet taken its shape, but the direction was set now, quietly and without announcement. In the winter cold of a morning in Kyushu, after a man named Miyake Gunbei had done his best, and it had not been enough, Musashi stood in the space where the encounter had just ended. The air was cold. The shadows on the ground were precise and long. The blue sky above the mountains held nothing but light and the particular silence of high places in winter. He bowed. He turned. He walked. The last fight was over. The real work was just beginning. Chapter 9. The artist, brush, ink, and a different kind of precision. Hold a sheet of paper up to the light and look at it from the side. What you see is almost nothing. A surface measured in fractions of a millimeter. A plane so thin it barely exists as a physical object. And yet the distance between the brush and that surface, the moment just before the ink lands, is one of the most demanding spaces in any art form that has ever existed. Because what happens in that moment cannot be revised. It cannot be softened or corrected or moved slightly to improve the composition. It is what it is the instant it becomes. And what it is depends entirely on the quality of attention that preceded it. Musashi spent the second half of his life working in that space. Not occasionally, not as recreation, as practice. In the full sense of the word, he had spent decades giving weight to. The painting and the carving and the calligraphy that occupied an increasing portion of his days from his mid-30s onward were not the hobbies of a retired warrior. They were the continuation of the same fundamental inquiry through different instruments. The same question, addressed now through the creation of something rather than the defeat of something. What does complete attention actually produce when it is given without reservation to the work in front of it? Several of Musashi's paintings survive. They are held in temples, private collections, and museums in Japan. Art historians who approach them without any investment in the martial mythology surrounding their maker have consistently found work that occupies a serious position in the tradition of Japanese ink painting on its own terms. Not because of who made them, because of what they are. They are spare, extremely spare. The Japanese aesthetic tradition has a word for the meaningful use of empty space. Ma, The understanding that what is absent from an image is as significant as what is present, that the blank space around a painted form is not the absence of content, but a kind of content itself, charged and deliberate, as carefully considered as any brushstroke. Musashi's paintings work this principle with a severity that places them at one extreme, even within a tradition that already values it highly. Consider the painting known as Shrike on a dead branch, a single bird on a single bare branch. The branch enters the frame from the lower left, and the bird sits near its tip where the wood narrows to almost nothing. Around them is white space, not the white of an unfinished painting, the white of a decision, the decision that nothing else belongs here, that the bird and the branch and the void around them are the complete statement, and that adding anything would diminish everything. The bird is painted with an economy of brushwork that is almost aggressive in its refusal of ornament. No decorative strokes, no small additions to make the image more conventionally pleasing. The ink was applied in a very small number of strokes, each of which is exactly what it needs to be and nothing more. Just the bird, and the nothing around it, and the relationship between them, which is what the painting is actually about. The bird is alive. The branch is dead. The space around them is infinite and indifferent. The sky in the painting, which is not sky at all, but the white of the paper itself, left untouched, extends in every direction without boundary or explanation. The bird does not appear troubled by any of this. It sits with the compact readiness that small predatory birds have, watching something the viewer cannot see. In a world the painting does not explain and does not try to. Sit with that image for a moment. A bird on a dead branch, completely present to whatever it is watching, completely untroubled by the dead wood beneath its feet or the infinite space around it, not performing readiness, not demonstrating it, simply in it, the way a thing is in its own nature when it has not been divided from itself by thought or fear or the need for the world to be other than it is. The man who painted this had spent 30 years learning to exist in conditions that did not explain themselves, who had moved through a world that offered no guarantees beyond what the quality of one's own attention could create, who had found in those conditions not primarily suffering, but a specific kind of clarity. The clarity that only comes when everything unnecessary has been removed, and what remains is exactly what the situation requires and nothing else. He was not painting a symbol of himself. He was painting what he had come to understand about the quality of presence that the practice was trying to produce, and the painting carries that understanding, the way a brushstroke carries the quality of attention behind it, completely, without the possibility of revision, in the permanent record of a single committed moment. Another painting, known as Hote Walking, offers a different register entirely. Hote is the wandering Buddhist monk associated with contentment and the acceptance of circumstance. In Musashi's rendering, he is mid-stride, moving forward with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who knows where they are going without being in any hurry to arrive. He carries an enormous cloth bag over one shoulder, slightly too large for him, slightly absurd in its dimensions. His body expresses simultaneously the weight of what he carries and the absolute lightness with which he carries it. There is humour in the painting, genuine humour, the kind that belongs to a person who has accepted the comedy of the human situation without being defeated by it. The painting carries warmth, more warmth than the shrike, more human texture, more of the quality the Japanese tradition associates with the acceptance of human limitation and the specific pleasure that such acceptance makes possible. It is significant that Musashi chose this subject. A man who had fought 60 duels and survived 2 major battles, who had never held a permanent position or a permanent home, who had given very little to ordinary comfort and very much to a practice that could not love him back, was painting a figure whose defining quality was contentment with exactly that kind of life. Consider what that means. This is not the painting of a man who had come to regret his choices. This is not the work of someone looking back at the road and wishing they had taken a different one. This is the painting of a man who had arrived, through the long hard work of extreme experience, at something that genuinely resembled what Hotei's round face expresses. Not happiness in the uncomplicated sense, something more earned and more stable. The particular ease that belongs to a person who has stopped fighting the conditions of their existence and started living entirely within them. He had walked alone for a very long time, carrying a bag that the world found slightly too large and slightly absurd, and he had found, in the carrying, something that lighter loads do not produce. His carving work shows the same qualities in a different medium. A carved wooden figure of Kannon, the Buddhist deity of compassion, attributed to this period and preserved in a temple in Kumamoto, carries in its proportions and in the surface of the wood the specific quality of attention that his paintings also carry. The quality of a hand completely present to what it was doing, not performing presence, not demonstrating skill, present in the way that a sword cut is present, fully committed to the single, irreversible moment of its making. The painter and calligrapher Honami Koetsu, one of the most celebrated artists of the early Edo period, reportedly encountered Musashi's work and found in it something remarkable, specifically because of what it lacked. This account appears in sources compiled some time after the fact, and carries the character of anecdote rather than direct testimony, so it should be held with appropriate care. But whether or not those exact words were spoken, the observation is accurate in a way that anyone who has looked carefully at the paintings can verify. There is no performance in them. This is, when you think about it, the same thing that had been consistently noted about his fighting. No performance, no gesture toward what a swordsman was supposed to look like, no concession to the conventions of appearance that his contemporaries mostly honoured, just the thing itself, done with the absolute economy of a person who had spent enough time with what was real to have no patience left for what was merely expected. The brush was just a brush. The sword was just a sword. What made either of them matter was the quality of presence brought to the moment of their use. A shrike on a dead branch, completely in its own nature, watching something the rest of us cannot see. A wandering monk with a heavy bag and a light step, finding the comedy and the contentment in the carrying. A figure of compassion carved by hands that had spent decades learning what their opposite cost. The same man, the same practice, the same question, arriving at last at something that looked, from a sufficient distance, remarkably like an answer. Chapter 10. The Book of Five Rings. What he actually wrote. A book written at the end of a life is a different object from a book written in the middle of one. A book written in the middle of a life is still, in some sense, a proposal. It has the energy of something not yet fully tested. A book written at the end, by someone who has been moving in a single, serious direction for 60 years, and who knows the movement is nearly over, is something else entirely. It is testimony. not the testimony of a witness reporting an external event, the testimony of a person reporting what the long internal event of their own life has produced, what it cost, what it clarified, what it was actually for. Musashi wrote that kind of book in the cave on the mountain, beginning in the winter of 1643. He called it the Go Rin No Sho, the Book of 5 Rings. The 5 rings refer to the 5 elements of the classical Japanese cosmological system: earth, water, fire, wind, and void, which he used as an organizing framework for 5 scrolls covering different aspects of his understanding of strategy and the way of the sword. He addressed the book to his student Terao Magonoho. He wrote it with the particular compression of a man who had limited time and no interest in using any of it on anything less than essential. Here is something the popular treatments of this book almost never say. The Go Rin No Sho was not written for publication. It was not written for an audience of thousands or millions. It was written for one person, a single student named Terao Magonoho, who had earned, through years of serious practice under Musashi's direct instruction, the right to receive what his teacher had spent a lifetime building. Think about what that means. The most widely read book about strategy and mastery in the history of martial arts was a private letter, a transmission between 2 specific people, one of whom had done the work and one of whom was being trusted to receive it. The public did not enter into the calculation. The marketplace did not enter into it. The question of how it would be received or interpreted or used by people who had no relationship with its author did not enter into it at all. It was, in the most precise sense, a gift, given because the giver had something real to transmit and had found someone real enough to receive it. That the gift eventually travelled across 4 centuries to reach people in languages and circumstances Musashi could not have imagined does not change what it was at the moment of its making. It was a private act of trust between a teacher and a student. Everything that happened to it afterward was a consequence of what that trust produced. One clarification about the book's later history. When the first widely available English translations appeared in the 1970s, the Go Rin No Sho found an unexpected audience in the American business world. By the 1980s, it was on the reading lists of executives and military officers across the Western world. The book sold tens of millions of copies in dozens of languages. The portions that translate into general competitive strategy are real, but the book is a technical and philosophical manual for people serious about martial arts, built on 60 years of direct experience with conditions that provided unforgiving feedback about whether what Musashi understood was actually true. Extracting the strategic principles without the context is like taking the load-bearing walls out of a house to use as fencing material. The wood is real. The use is not what the structure was built for. Here is what he actually wrote. The Earth Scroll functions as an introduction and a statement of principles. Musashi opens by telling the reader who he is and how he came to write this book, his background, his path without a teacher or a school, the conclusions that path produced. He is direct about his intentions. He is writing for people who want to genuinely understand the way of strategy, not for people who want the appearance of understanding it. If you want the appearance, the schools will provide it. This book is for something else. He establishes a distinction that runs through everything that follows. The distinction between the way of strategy and what he calls the way of technique. Technique is what schools teach. the collection of specific forms and movements and timing systems that practitioners spend years learning to execute with precision. Technique matters. Musashi spent his entire life developing it at the highest available level. But technique, in the absence of the underlying principle, breaks under sufficient pressure, because it was built for the conditions it was trained in, not for the conditions it will actually face. The way of strategy is the underlying principle. What remains when every specific technique has been stripped away and you are left with the direct perception of what is actually happening and the capacity to respond without the interference of habit or expectation? The water scroll is the most technically specific of the 5. It addresses body posture, grip, footwork, gaze, the management of distance. Musashi grounds every recommendation in the same question he applies to everything. What actually works when the situation is real and the opponent is not cooperating with your expectations? His treatment of gaze deserves particular attention. He identifies 2 kinds of seeing: the eye that looks, the gaze fixed on a specific point, and the eye that perceives, the broader, softer attention that takes in the whole situation without fixing on any part of it. He argues that the practitioner needs to operate primarily from the second kind. A fighter who watches the opponent's sword sees the sword and misses the body. A fighter who watches the opponent's eyes sees the intention and misses the technique. A fighter who perceives with the broader attention sees everything simultaneously and responds to the whole. This is not mysticism. It is a practical observation about attention that serious practitioners in domains from combat sports to surgical medicine have independently arrived at across the centuries since. The Fire Scroll addresses the dynamics of combat in conditions of greater complexity. Timing, the reading of an opponent's rhythm, the use of environment and positioning. This is where Musashi's thinking most clearly extends beyond individual combat. His treatment of timing is the most fully developed section of the book. He distinguishes between the timing of action and the timing of inaction. Knowing when not to move is as essential as knowing when to move, and most practitioners, including many who are technically skilled, err consistently toward acting too early, before the moment has fully clarified, because the anxiety of waiting is more uncomfortable than the risk of premature action. He is describing something that applies to every domain in which decisions must be made under uncertainty and pressure. Every domain. The Wind Scroll is Musashi's systematic examination of what the other schools of his era were teaching and why he found it insufficient. He goes through the major approaches one by one. Schools that emphasize strength above all other qualities, those that emphasize speed, those that build their systems around particular signature techniques. His criticism of each is specific and grounded in practical observation. This approach to speed produces fighters who rush before they have perceived clearly. This signature technique is dangerous because an opponent who has seen it once knows how to respond to it the second time. The Wind Scroll reads as the work of a man who spent decades watching skilled people fail in predictable ways, and who found the predictability both practically significant and genuinely sad. Serious practitioners failed by frameworks that were elegant and internally consistent, but that had not been tested against the conditions they claimed to address. There is something worth noting about this section that the popular treatments tend to miss. Musashi's criticism of other schools in the Wind Scroll is not primarily an argument for his own superiority. It is a demonstration of a process. The process of honest examination, looking at what is actually producing outcomes rather than at what the tradition claims is producing them. The same process he applied to every encounter on the road for 30 years. The same process he was asking his reader to apply to the Go Rin No Sho itself. He was not saying, "Trust me instead of the other schools." He was saying, "Trust the process of honest looking, and if that process leads you to conclusions different from mine, follow where it leads. The void scroll is the shortest and the most difficult. The Japanese term is ku. It carries associations with emptiness, with openness, with the absence of fixed form. Musashi uses it to describe the condition he considers the end point of serious practice, a state in which the practitioner has moved entirely past the interference of conceptual thinking and operates from direct perception and response. He does not present this as mysticism. He presents it as the practical result of doing the work completely. The void is not something you achieve by meditating on emptiness. It emerges from the accumulated pressure of serious practice over a long time. When enough of the noise of the untrained mind has been worn away by repetition and pressure and honest engagement with conditions that do not permit the maintenance of comfortable illusions, he writes in the void scroll that the way of strategy is the way of nature, not nature in the romantic sense. Nature in the sense of what is actually the case, stripped of the overlay of preference and expectation, and the desire for the world to be other than it is. A person who has arrived at that stripping, who can see what is actually in front of them without the distortion of what they wish were there, who can respond to what is rather than to what they expected, has found the void, not as an absence, as the fullest possible presence. This is what 60 years of practice had produced in the man writing in the small, warm light of the cave. Not a collection of techniques, not a system of rules, a way of seeing. And in the Go Rin No Sho, working carefully with the brush moving across the paper, he was trying to transmit that way of seeing to the one person he trusted to receive it. The book was finished sometime in the spring of 1645. He gave it to Terao Maganoho. Then he picked up the brush again. For one more thing, something the Go Rin No Sho, in all its careful structure, had approached from the outside, but had not quite said directly. He had 9 days left to write it. Chapter 11. Dokkodo. 21 rules written 9 days before death. Set the 5 scrolls aside. Set aside the technical system and the careful analysis of timing and gaze and the failures of competing schools. Set aside the framework and the accumulated weight of strategic principle that the book took a lifetime to build. What is left, when you remove all of that, is a man who is dying and who knows it, sitting in a cave on a mountain in the last available light of his working life, picking up the brush one more time. What he wrote is called the Dokkodo, the way of walking alone. 21 short precepts. Each one takes perhaps 10 seconds to read and a lifetime to understand. He wrote them 9 days before he died. He gave them to Terao Maganojo alongside the Go Rin No Sho. 2 documents. 1, the work of years. 1, the work of days. The Go Rin No Sho tells you how to see. The Dokkodo tells you how to be. What the Dokkodo actually is. Underneath the popular treatments that either romanticize it as the wisdom of a perfect sage or reduce it to motivational phrases, is something more specific and more honest. It is a confession, not in the religious sense, in the older sense of the word, a declaration of what a person actually believes, stripped of the social softening that ordinary discourse applies to difficult truths. written by someone who no longer has any reason to soften anything, because the time for that is over. The first precept: do not go against the way of the world. On the surface, this sounds like a counsel of conformity, but Musashi spent his entire life refusing to work within the established conditions of his world. He did not follow the schools. He did not serve a lord. If the first precept meant simple conformity, his own life would stand as its refutation. What it means is something harder and more specific. The world does not arrange itself for your convenience. It has never done this, and it will not begin doing it for you. The question is not whether the conditions are the ones you would have chosen. The question is whether you can act with full commitment inside the conditions that are actually there. Stop expending energy on resistance to what is real. Direct that energy entirely toward what is possible within the actual conditions you face. He had learned this not from a teacher, but from 60 years of pressing himself against conditions that did not care what he preferred. Every road in winter, every opponent who did not cooperate with what the form assumed, every year of isolation that the institutional world offered no reward for enduring. Not one of those conditions had changed because he preferred them to be different, and not one of them had stopped him. The second precept: do not seek pleasure for its own sake. A life organized around the pursuit of pleasure produces attachment. Attachment produces dependency. Dependency distorts the one thing that the way requires above all others. Perception, clear, undefended, undistorted perception of what is actually there. He did not live without pleasure. But pleasure, as an organizing principle, was something he had understood early as incompatible with the practice. It divides attention. It creates needs that the conditions may not satisfy. It makes a person smaller than their actual situation because they are spending part of themselves on wanting things to be comfortable rather than seeing things as they are. The seventh precept: never be jealous of others in any situation. Jealousy requires a comparison. The belief that what another person has is something you should have. A person genuinely committed to their own path does not have the architecture that jealousy requires. There is only the work and what the work demands, and whether you are meeting that demand or not. Other people's conditions are real. They are irrelevant. He had watched men with lords' patronage and institutional standing and the social warmth of belonging to something larger than themselves. He did not, as far as the record shows, express anything resembling a wish that he had chosen differently, not because those things lacked value, because the path he was on could not accommodate them without becoming a different path. The 10th precept: do not grieve when parting from people. This one carries the weight of a specific kind of loneliness. His entire life was structured around departure. He moved. He taught and then moved on. He made connections and then left them behind. The people who knew him could not count on his continued presence. The precept does not say that parting does not matter. It says not to be stopped by it, not to let the accumulated weight of departure become a refusal of further departure. He had said goodbye many times. He was about to say the last one. The 16th precept: do not pursue the taste of good food. Simple, flat. The statement of a man who had spent decades eating what the road provided and who had found, through long practice, that the attention directed toward the taste of good food was attention that could not simultaneously be directed toward the quality of seeing the practice required. You cannot pursue two things with complete attention. He had learned this early. He had lived it completely. And then the 21st precept, the last one, never stray from the way. Set it next to the others and feel the weight of it. Everything in the Dokkodo has been building toward this. The preceding 20 precepts are, each in their own way, descriptions of the specific forms that straying takes, the pursuit of pleasure, the management of appearance, the dependency on others' approval, the grief of parting, the attachment to comfort, the jealousy of other paths. Each of these is a way of leaving the way without appearing to leave it, a drift so gradual that the person drifting does not always notice until the distance from the original direction has become too great to recover easily. Never stray from the way, not when it is convenient, not when the conditions are favourable, not when the people around you understand what you are doing and why. Always. Now sit with the man who wrote this. He was 60 years old. Approximately, he was dying. He had been living in a stone cave for several months. He had completed the Go Rin No Sho and handed it to his student. He had given away most of what he owned. He was writing the Dokkodo in what remained of his working time. He was not a perfect man. He had killed a child in Kyoto. He had fought on the losing side of 2 wars that defined his era. He had given very little to the people who cared about him, and very much to a practice that had no warmth to give in return. He had lived in a way that the people around him often found incomprehensible. He had done all of this with his eyes open. He had not revised the accounting. He had not softened the costs in retrospect to make the choices look cleaner than they were. He had looked at what his life had been, completely and without the comfort of selective memory, and he had written down what he found. The Dokkodo is the evidence of that honesty. 21 statements, not flinching, not softening, not offering the comfort of a framework that makes the way seem easier than it is, or less costly, or more compatible with an ordinary human life than it actually is. This is what it takes. This is what it costs. This is what it produces. If you do it all the way through, without stopping, without trading the way for any of the many things the world will offer you in exchange for leaving it, he had done it all the way through. The lamp burned steady in the cave. Outside, the mountain held its ancient silence. Inside, the brush moved across the paper with the same quality of attention it had brought to everything across a very long life. One precept, then another, each one a life's worth of experience pressed into a single sentence. The way a river presses through a narrow place and emerges on the other side, carrying everything it has gathered in the miles before. Concentrated now, moving faster, clear. 21 times the brush touched the paper. 21 times something irreversible was made, and then he put the brush down. Chapter 12. The Cave and the Last Days. The silence of stone is different from other kinds of silence. It is not the silence of a quiet room, not the silence of a sleeping house or a forest at night. The silence of stone is geological. It is the silence of something that has been present for longer than any human life or any human institution, that has absorbed everything that has happened within it and continues, unchanged, while everything else moves and changes around it. Heigundo. The cave on the face of Mount Iwato in the province of Higo in Kyushu had been a place of religious significance long before Musashi arrived. The name means roughly the cave of spiritual power. It cuts into the mountain at an elevation that places it above the ordinary movements of the world below, above the sounds of the village, above the paths that daily life uses, in a zone of quiet that the people who came here across generations understood as something to work with rather than something to escape from. Musashi arrived in approximately 1643. He was near 60 years of age. He was ill. The nature of the illness is not described in clinical terms in any surviving source. What the accounts convey is a picture of progressive physical decline, serious enough that the continued motion that had defined his life for decades was no longer sustainable. The body that had carried him through 60 duels and 2 wars and thousands of miles of road was presenting its final accounting, and the accounting was coming due in ways that the will could slow but not reverse. He did not respond to this with complaint. The sources that cover his final years describe a man who moved through the diminishment of his physical capacity with the same equanimity he had brought to everything else in his long life, the same refusal to require that conditions be other than they were, the same attention directed at what was actually present rather than at what was being lost. He had written in the Dokkodo that one should not grieve when parting from people. He appears to have extended this principle to include parting from the capacities of his own body. He did not grieve. He worked with what remained, and what remained was considerable. He worked in the mornings, when the light coming through the cave's opening was good, and the body had whatever energy the night had restored. The light in the cave at that hour had a particular quality, angled and warm in autumn, flatter and colder in winter, always moving as the morning progressed, always changing the character of the shadows on the stone wall opposite the entrance. He rested in the afternoons. In the evenings he sat in the way that a person sits when they are not waiting for anything, and not avoiding anything, and not performing anything for anyone. Simply present to the stone and the silence and the light, moving slowly across the floor as the day completed itself. The Go Rin No Sho was composed in this cave. The Dokkodo was written here. The final paintings were made here. Some of them in the last weeks of his life, when the mornings were the only time the body had what the work required. There is something worth sitting with in that. A man in the last reduction of his circumstances, in a stone cave on a mountain, his possessions almost entirely given away, his students no longer in daily attendance, his body failing in ways the will could slow but not reverse, and in those conditions producing the work that would carry his understanding forward across 4 centuries to people he could not have imagined in a world he could not have conceived. The narrowing had focused rather than diminished what remained. His students came sometimes. Terao Magonoho was present in the final period, receiving the documents and carrying them carefully down the mountain, understanding that what was being given to him was not simply paper and ink, but the distilled record of a life that could not be reproduced. Other students made the journey up the path. The accounts suggest Musashi received them with warmth and without the quality of need that would have made his dying dependent on the comfort of company. He was glad to see them. He was not undone when they left. He had been practicing aloneness for 60 years. By the end, it was not a condition he endured. It was a condition he inhabited as naturally as other people inhabit the presence of family and community. In the weeks before his death, he gave away what remained of his possessions. His swords went to students who had earned them. One sword in particular, a piece he had carried for many years, he held for a moment before giving it away, turned it once in his hands the way a craftsman handles a good tool at the end of a long project, acknowledging what it has been through without sentimentality about what comes next. Then he gave it away. The wooden figures he had carved went to the temples that had provided him with the kind of quiet company that temples provide. The company of a tradition too old and too serious to require anything particular from the people who come to sit within it. His paintings went to the Hosokawa family and to others he wished to honour. He did this methodically and without apparent sentiment. Each thing went where it was supposed to go. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was held back. He died on the 19th day of the 5th month of 1645. He was near 60 years of age. He had been in the cave for approximately 2 years. He had completed the 2 works that would carry his understanding forward past his own death. He had given away everything he owned. He had said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it. He died, according to the accounts, in a seated position, with a quality of composed attention that his students recognized as the same quality he had brought to every serious thing across his entire life. Not the theatrical composure of a man performing his own ending for an audience, the actual composure of a person who has made his peace, not with death specifically, with the whole of what his life has been, the costs and the achievements and the loneliness and the clarity and the 60 fights and the 2 lost wars and the paintings and the cave and the 21 precepts and the brush put down 9 days before the end. The mountain did not respond. The silence did not change. The light moved across the stone floor in its slow arc and continued moving after he was gone. The way light continues, indifferent and precise, doing what it has always done, regardless of what is present to witness it. The cave is still there. It sits in the face of Mount Iwato in what is now Kumamoto Prefecture in Kyushu, accessible by a path that winds up through the trees in the way that paths to old places tend to wind, as if the path itself wants to give you time to decide whether you are serious before you arrive. Inside, the cave is smaller than you might expect. The stone floor is worn smooth. The light comes in at an angle that changes with the hour and the season. In winter it is cold in the specific way that stone is cold, holding the cold longer than the air around it, releasing it slowly and without apology. It does not feel like a monument. It feels like a place where something real happened, and where something of what happened is still present in the stone. The way stone holds everything it has witnessed, without comment and without loss. Rest there for a moment. If you are still with me, the mountain is quiet. The stone is old and patient. We are almost at the end. Chapter 13. Why he still matters. The question underneath the sword. Step back from the cave. Step back from the 21 precepts and the 5 scrolls and the 60 fights and the road years and the 2 lost wars and the paintings and the students who carried the teaching forward. Step back and ask the question that is really underneath all of it. Why are we here? Why is a man who died in a cave on a mountain in the 17th century still being read, still being translated into languages he never heard, still being carried into domains he never imagined, by people across the world who have never held a sword and never intend to? The Go Rin No Sho has been in continuous circulation in Japan since the decades following Musashi's death. Its global reach expanded dramatically in the 1970s when the first widely available English translations appeared. By the 1980s, it was on the reading lists of executives and military officers and competitive athletes across the Western world. By the 21st century, it had been translated into dozens of languages and had sold tens of millions of copies across its various editions. What was happening there? Part of the answer is the authority of complete commitment. Musashi did not theorize about strategy from a position of intellectual distance. He did not develop his framework in a library and test it selectively in controlled conditions. He lived the way of strategy, completely and without reservation, across 6 decades of conditions that provided continuous and unforgiving feedback about whether what he understood was actually true. Every principle in the Go Rin No Sho has been through the specific testing process that only real confrontation with real consequences provides. None of it is decorative. None of it is there because it sounds good or fits a satisfying pattern. It is there because it worked. In conditions where not working meant dying. Against opponents who were themselves trying their hardest to make it not work. That quality of tested authority is rare in any century. We live in a period that has particular reasons to value it. A hunger, visible across many different parts of the contemporary world, for things that are real, for frameworks that hold up when the conditions are genuinely difficult, for the testimony of people who have actually done the thing they are talking about, all the way through. Without the safety net of institutional backing or the protective distance of theory, Musashi's life stands as one of the most complete examples we have of a human being who built a way of being in the world entirely from direct experience. Without institutional support, without the borrowed authority of a tradition, without a community of people who could validate the framework for him, and who tested that way against the hardest available conditions across a span of time long enough to eliminate the possibility that the results were accidental. That is genuinely rare, not just in his period, in any period. But there is something else underneath the strategic appeal, something more personal and harder to name, something that has nothing to do with competitive advantage and everything to do with the question that sits at the bottom of every serious human life. What is this for? Not in the abstract philosophical sense. In the specific and daily sense, what is the work for? What is the practice for? What is the thing that makes the difficulty worth enduring, and the loneliness worth carrying, and the cost of complete commitment worth paying? Musashi's life does not answer this question for anyone else. His answer was his own, specific to the particular shape of his capacities and his character and the world he moved through. No one should try to live his life. It was not designed for replication, but the seriousness with which he pursued the question, the refusal to let it go unanswered, the willingness to pay whatever the honest pursuit of it required across 60 years of conditions that did not make it easy. That is not specific to him. That is available to anyone willing to ask the question honestly and follow it wherever it goes. Now, a man near 60 years old sits in a cave on a mountain in the province of Higo. The autumn has turned. The air coming through the cave's opening carries the first real cold of the season. The smell of pine and stone, and the particular quality of mountain air when the warmth has finally left it for the year. The oil lamp throws its small warm circle of light against the stone. The inkstone is ready. The paper is before him. His hands move to the brush. Not with urgency, not with the quality of a man racing against time, though he knows the time is limited, with the quality of complete attention that has always belonged to him at his best, the same attention he brought to the road, to the encounters, to the practice halls, to the paintings, to the students. The brush touches the paper. Outside, the autumn forest holds its breath in the particular way that forests hold their breath when the season is turning, and everything alive in them is making the adjustments that survival requires. The cold is coming. The light is changing. The long process of the year is doing what it has always done, indifferent to the man in the cave and to the words accumulating on the paper before him. But the words are accumulating, stroke by stroke, in the small, warm circle of light on the stone floor of the cave on the mountain. Something is being made that will outlast the man making it, outlast the mountain holding him, outlast everything that was present on that autumn morning, except the words themselves and the understanding they carry. The lamp burns. The brush moves. The mountain is quiet around him. Good night.